All right, good evening. I'm Chris Avila from the Waco Metropolitan Planning Organization, and I'd like to welcome you to our public informational meeting that we're hosting tonight about a couple of actions that are being considered by the Policy Board a little later this month. One of the things we want to make sure about is that you understand and know about what it is that's being proposed, and to give you the opportunity to let us know if you think we're on the right track or if we ought to be considering something different. What we're looking at today is our transportation improvement program and pavement and bridge condition targets. Now, before we get to that, we do want to review what the Metropolitan Planning Organization is and what its role is, since this may be the first time that you have interacted with the MPO or have participated in a public process for us. And then we'll go ahead and review what the Transportation Improvement Program is, review what we're proposing to change from that document, and then what we're looking at in terms of pavement and bridge condition targets for 2 years from now, and then give you an opportunity to give us some feedback after all of that. So what is the Metropolitan Planning Organization? Basically, we're a federal program whose sole purpose is really to provide local input into important transportation decisions. We want to make sure that what is moving forward is what our community thinks is important and thinks ought to be moving forward. And we also want to have an honest conversation about what can our community realistically afford over the next 25-year planning horizon. We also want to give our local leaders and to give you, the public, the opportunity to input on how federal highway and public transportation dollars are used within our region. And ultimately, really, we want you to have the opportunity to determine what our transportation network looks like in the future and how it functions and how it serves our community. So the MPO covers all of McLennan County. It is a federal program that is required for all urbanized areas that have more than 50,000 people. So as a result, there are about 420 or so MPOs across the United States. Our MPO is governed by a 20-member policy board, primarily elected officials, but some of our smaller communities have chosen to be represented by staff. That policy board also has representatives from the McLennan County Commissioners Court and the Texas Department of Transportation. And they are advised by a 36-member technical committee, which is composed of professional engineers, planners, and also stakeholder interests from folks like Waco Transit or Waco Regional Airport and other important stakeholders to our region, such as the Waco Industrial Foundation, Waco Chamber of Commerce, and folks like and Baylor University, for instance. Sorry about that. And what we want to do is bring together the various interests of our region to make sure that the priorities that have been identified for our region are really what we consider to be the most important. Go to the next slide. So the document that we're looking at today is the Transportation Improvement Program. This is a short-range 4-year document that is basically identifying what projects need to be moving towards construction or what projects need to be implemented in the next 4 years. This includes more than just construction. This includes any kind of engineering design or right-of-way acquisition, or in the case of public transportation, it might be the implementation of a new service. Now, this slide has a lot going on here, but what I wanted to show you is that the tip is actually the very last thing that we do as part of the planning process before we start bringing in bulldozers to actually build something. But this is actually the end of a very long process that's already taken place. And it started off with input from citizens and stakeholders who said, we really need something done to address an issue or a problem. And then we as staff take a look at what came out of that process to see what ideas do the best job of taking care of that problem. Those are then projects that find their way into the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. And the key part of that plan is only those projects that we realistically can fund in the next 25 years can actually be included in that plan. Now, the most important priorities in that plan are then part of the short range plan, which are the ones that we think need to go to implementation in the next 10 years. And there's a lot of work that needs to take place in the next 10 years. Things like getting the engineering design complete, getting the environmental studies complete, utility relocation, acquiring right-of-way if necessary. And once a project is completed that readiness phase, then we can start talking about, well, how are we going to pay for it? You know, if someone is agreeing to pay for that project, that's when we start talking about the Transportation Improvement Program, which is what we're talking about today. Now, there's a lot going on with that slide. If you have an interest in more details on that, please feel free to contact us, and we'll have our contact information at the end of this presentation. So the most important thing to be included in the TIP is that, one, it's got to be part of our transportation plan, which is that 25-year vision of the most important priorities of our region. We also have to have a commitment for funding. Someone has to agree to pay for it. And then we have to have all the preliminary work complete before we can start talking about putting the project into our TIP. So let's find out where we are today. And so there are a number of changes that we need to talk about. And again, a lot of this is related to funding. So back on June 18th, we actually adopted the current TIP. Now, that TIP was being developed under a very different set of fiscal constraints than what it turns out we find ourselves in right now. There's a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is related to COVID. About 2 months later, in August, we were informed that statewide, there's just way too many projects being programmed for the amount of money that's available. And so we, along with our 22 other counterparts across the state of Texas, were told you're going to have to remove some projects from your TIPs in order to be fiscally constrained. And so that's really where we find ourselves today. We have to identify projects. They're not being removed, but they are being postponed to sometime after the year 2024. So our dilemma is that we had $70 million that we had to remove. Since we only had 134 million identified previously, this is a lot of projects that are going to be impacted here. And so we had 4 highway construction projects scheduled for this fiscal year originally, and 2 more scheduled for fiscal year 23. That's going to be very, very different now. So back in September, we actually came up with a plan that brought us down about $51 million, which was actually less than what we were originally directed, but we thought we had some flexibility based on some feedback that we received from TxDOT. And that's what we presented to you back in September. Now, we've gotten some subsequent feedback from TxDOT saying that wasn't sufficient, that additional projects are going to have to be removed. Now, we perhaps could have continued to move forward, but we as staff certainly didn't feel comfortable with that, and the policy board absolutely didn't feel comfortable with that. And so we're bringing this back to you for your consideration, since this is very different than what we presented to you back in September. So initially, we had 3 projects that were being removed. We had 2 phases of I-35. Actually, they're kind of sub-phases of I-35. There's actually more work that needs to be done for this section between South 12th Street and all the way down to Loop 340 near Central Texas Marketplace. but we just don't have the money for those two phases at this time. And then there was a project on Highway 6 between McLaughlin Road and Lady Bird Road, or effectively FM 185, that again, we no longer have the money to get this done before 2024. Originally, we thought we were going to be able to move forward with Spring Valley Road in the Hewitt area. We also thought we had enough to do two overpasses on Highway 31, one at the interchange with FM 2311 and FM 939. And then be able to move up the mall-to-mall project, which is the section of Loop 340 between Central Texas Marketplace and Richland Mall, move that up a couple of years and be able to add some incentive money to get that construction moving forward faster than a normal process would take. So that's what we thought we were in September. And then, of course, one of the things that we also want to do is, because we're not talking about removing these projects altogether, we're just talking about going forward with them sometime after 2024, we still want the preliminary work to continue. And in order to accomplish that, we have to put these projects in what we call Appendix D. And so we're actually moving these projects from a funded portion of the TIP to something that's a little bit after 2024. And this is necessary for the federal process so that we can still receive environmental clearance and still be able to do things like acquire right-of-way and relocate utilities, etc. And so what we would be adding is, of course, that section of Highway 6 that we talked about earlier between McLaughlin Road and Lady Bird Road. And then for I-35, we're just adding the whole phase of work between South 12th Street to Loop 340, because really, ideally, you do the whole project all at once, not just piecemeal in several different phases. So I mentioned that wasn't sufficient. So we needed to identify another $18.5 million of cuts in order to meet fiscal constraint requirements that have been identified by TxDOT. So here's where we're moving forward with. And again, yes, this is very different from what we had previously. And so let's move to the next slide. So now where we are is, in addition to what we were moving out of the TIP previously, so two sections of I-35, a section of Highway 6, we're also going to have to move out the Spring Valley Road project in Hewitt. We also are going to have to remove one of the overpasses on State Highway 31. So we're only leaving now the bridge at FM 939 as moving forward. And then mall-to-mall remains, but it wouldn't be fiscal year 21. It would actually be next fiscal year, although that's still November of this year. And instead of a $4 million incentive to expedite construction, we're only looking at $2 million, which turns out that that is the new maximum that we can that we are allowed to do. So it's still a little bit more than what we were originally directed to by TxDOT, but we have received direction last month that this is okay, this is close enough. And so we are now moving forward and asking for your feedback on this proposal. So this is a map showing you all the projects that were originally in this document back in June and what has changed with them. So the ones in red, we're having to move beyond the year 2024. The ones in, well, the one project in orange, which is the mall-to-mall project, is actually moving up a full fiscal year from what we originally thought. And then there's really only one project that isn't changing, although it actually is changing in a small way, and that is, instead of having a mix of federal and state dollars, it's now going to be 100% state dollars instead. Now, the Appendix D that I mentioned to you, This means we have a couple more projects we need to add to that. That's the Spring Valley project and the Highway 31 overpass at FM 2311. Now, the hope is that we can bring those back into a funded condition shortly. But until something changes with the funding scenario that the state is in, for right now, they're kind of in a paused state until sometime after 2024. And this map shows you those projects that we've just added or that we're proposing to add, along with the projects that were already in that appendix that have not changed their status. And that includes things like the Franklin New Road interchange or a section of Loop 340 in the Belmead area. So we're in the middle of receiving public comment on this proposal, and we are accepting comments through this Friday, which is January 14th. Now, even if you have a comment that you want to propose, there still is an opportunity for you to get that in front of the policy board. We are having a formal public hearing at the beginning of the policy board meeting, which is Thursday, January 21st. And if you want to address the policy board, we do ask that you register with us prior to 10 o'clock in the morning on January 21st. And we'll make sure that you have that opportunity to address the board at that time. Or if you wish, you can send us an email or a written comment, and we'll be more than happy to read that to the policy board during that meeting. So that's where we are with the proposed changes to the TIP. Now what we want to do is shift gears here and look at the condition of pavements and bridges within our region, or at least what we would like them to be, or what the state of Texas would also like them to be by the year 2022. And so let's just real quickly review some initial information. So the first thing is that this is a federal requirement now for the portion of our highway network that's called the National Highway System. It is a subset of the overall roadway network. It includes all the interstate highway system, includes everything that's defined as a freeway. It also includes everything that's defined as a principal arterial. Principal arterials could be something like Waco Drive, for instance. It's only 11% of the total actually lane miles, but it carries 60% of the traffic of our region. So these really are the most important facilities within our region. But keep in mind, the MPO actually tracks the condition of all arterial and collector roads within our region. So that actually is about almost 40% of the lane miles of the region, but it's almost 80% of the travel within the region. So we have an interest in much more than just the NHS system, but under the federal requirements, we are required to track the condition of the NHS system and also make sure that they're meeting a particular standard in the future. So if you're interested in what the National Highway System actually looks like right now, this map shows that. Of course, Interstate 35 is in blue, and that's the only interstate class facility we have in the Waco region. But everything that's in red here is the remainder of the National Highway System. And so what brings us here today is that 2 years ago, the state of Texas adopted their targets for pavement and bridge condition for this NHS system. And that requires MPOs to then assess whether we want to support those targets or whether something different is appropriate for our region. These are 4-year targets, but after 2 years, this TxDOT and MPOs, for that matter, can do a reassessment. We track how pavement condition is changing. We also detect or track how bridge condition is changing. And if things are changing differently than what we had originally anticipated, we actually have the option at the midpoint to make a change. And so TxDOT, looking at the condition of pavements and bridges from a statewide perspective, realized, yeah, things are tracking a little bit differently than what they anticipated. So they took advantage of this opportunity and made a few changes to those targets. And since the Waco MPO 2 years ago chose to support those state targets more, for the most part, there was one where we chose to do something different. That triggers a requirement for us to decide, do we still want to support those targets, or is it time to consider something different? And we have 180 days after TxDOT made that decision to decide that for ourselves. So for pavements, we have to separate out interstate pavements from the rest of the national highway system, mainly because under federal law, the interstate system is held to a higher standard. And so we do have to take that into consideration here. And if you're interested in how pavement condition is defined as good versus poor, and what the difference is between the interstate standard versus the rest of the national highway system, again, we'd be more than happy to talk with you about that. Feel free to give us a call, shoot us an email, contact us some other way. We'll be more than happy to sit down with you and review that. So let's take a look at good pavements, or the percentage of the system that's defined as good, and that's going to be the chart that's at the top of the slide here. For the interstate system, the good news is here in McLennan County, 76%, a little more than 76% of the interstate system is actually defined as good, or being in good condition. Now, this does not include the section that is currently under construction in downtown Waco. This is the remainder of the system. When we look at the rest of the national highway system, that was what was identified in red on the map that we showed you just a few moments ago. It's a little more than 55.5% of that system is defined as in good pavement condition. Now, from a statewide perspective, previously, TxDOT thought 66.6% of the interstate system was a good target for good pavement condition. And then for the rest of the national highway system, 55.2%. Looking at some trends, it was realized, yeah, things aren't trending as well as we were hoping, so they actually adjust those downwards just slightly late last year. The good news is, for our region, in both situations, we're well above the state average. And so our recommendation is that we do continue to support TxDOT's percent of good lane miles target. When we look at the percent of poor lane miles, for a lot of folks, this is what they think is more concerning than the percent that's considered good. The good news here, in McLennan County, there are no lane miles considered poor on the interstate highway system. Again, this is not counting the sections that are currently under construction, but the anticipation is that when that construction is completed, those pavements will be good as well. When we look at the non-interstate system, we're right at about 7% of that system being rated as poor. From the statewide perspective, previously, the thought was 0.3% of the interstate system was a good target for poor pavement condition. And for the rest of the NHS system, 14.3% was considered good as, for a poor condition target. Again, TxDOT took advantage of the opportunity to do an adjustment because things are trending a little bit differently than what was anticipated. And so the new target for TxDOT is 0.2% for interstates, 14.2% for the rest of the NHS system. Once again, we're significantly better than the rest of the state on both of these metrics. And so once again, our recommendation is to support the state targets and that there's really not a need to do something differently for our region. Now you'll note, if we can go back to the previous slide, there is a note here that is kind of important. And that is back in 2018, we noted that for the portion of the NHS system that was not interstate highway, we were not as good as the state. And so we felt, and there were a number of reasons why we felt that was the situation. And so we've actually adopted a different target than the state of Texas had. That's changed. And so now instead of not being as good as the state, we're actually a little bit better. So we're actually not going to be recommending a separate target for that particular metric. Okay, now we can go to bridges. And of course, we reiterated on that last slide what our recommendation is. Okay, so bridges. Here we're talking about bridge deck area. And the reason why we want to do that is we want to kind of take into account the more significant bridges. So if something's longer or something's wider, that's a more significant bridge than something that might be a very short bridge or only a 2-lane bridge, for instance. And again, there's quite a bit here towards how you define good deck area versus poor deck area. And if that's something that you have an interest in knowing more information about, please feel free to contact us. So here we're just looking at all bridges on the NHS system. We don't separate out the interstates. They're not held to a higher standard, unlike pavements. But we did identify the percent that have good and poor deck area. We did break that out for the two different subsets because there is significant work taking place on the interstate system right now that's going to influence future percentages for this particular metric. Now for good bridges, statewide, TxDOT identified 50.4% as being a good target. And they actually didn't recommend changing this particular one. Now you'll notice that for the most recent metric, or the most recent data that we have available, which was 2019, our region was a little bit less than the state average. But we're still recommending supporting the state target, mainly because a lot of that work that's occurring on the interstate system is going to dramatically improve that metric. There are a lot of bridges that are in the process of being replaced. There are a lot of bridges that are having work done to them. There are some bridges that are going away altogether as part of the interstate reconstruction, and that contains a lot of the bridges that are not defined as good. And so we anticipate that this percentage is actually going to increase very significantly between now and the year 2022. Good news, there are no poor bridges on the NHS system in McLennan County. So TxDOT felt statewide having 1.3% of those bridges being rated as poor was a good metric. Obviously, they took a look at that. Things aren't trending quite the way they were hoping, so they actually adjusted it to 1.5% from the state perspective. Our anticipation is that for us, we should be nowhere near those percentages for 2022. So once again, we're recommending supporting the state targets. And so just a quick note here, when it comes to pavement and bridge condition, state of Texas, in comparison to just about all other states, is doing significantly better. So that's one thing that we really need to recognize, and also recognize that TxDOT does a really good job of maintaining our system. So let's go to the next slide here. And so once again, remember, as a reminder, we're looking at a significant improvement in bridge condition as a result of the interstate reconstruction project. And so when we go to the next slide, we should have our recommendations, which are to support the state targets for both percent good deck area and percent poor deck area. So similar to the tip amendment that we mentioned earlier, we are accepting comments through the end of this Friday. And we are holding another public hearing on these targets in front of the policy board on Thursday, January 21st. So if you do have a comment that you want to get before the policy board and you is after the end of our comment period, you still have that opportunity to directly address the policy board. We just ask that you register with us before 10 a.m. on January 21st, or that you give us a written comment that we'd be more than happy to read before the policy board. Once again, the cutoff for that is 10 a.m. on the 21st. So this is your opportunity to give us feedback. There's actually no one else on the call today. So if you're looking at this presentation after the meeting and you want to get in contact with us, any of these methods work towards giving us your feedback. And again, we're not particular how you get it to us. Really, any method is perfectly acceptable. We do have to have a cutoff of this Friday for our process. But again, if you have something that comes to mind after that date, feel free to go ahead and send that to us, and we'll be more than happy to read that in front of the policy board.
So Chris, technically our public comment period ends on Thursday, the 14th, but if we get something on Friday, that should be no problem too.
Thank you, Chelsea. And I apologize for that, but yeah, as mentioned, as Chelsea mentioned, if you still get something to us by Friday, we can still incorporate that in the comments. So let's see, I think we have one more slide. Is that correct? No, we don't. Well, that is our presentation tonight. We want to thank you for your participation. We hope that this has been informative. This gives you some information that you can use to deciding whether you think we're on the right track or need to be going in a different direction. And keep in mind, the transportation planning process is a continuous process. So if you have something in mind that you think we ought to be considering as a region, or something that you think is important in terms of addressing a problem, at any moment, please feel free to contact us and let us know what your thoughts are or what your concerns are. And we'll add that into the mix of considerations that we'll be looking at for the next transportation plan update and the next transportation improvement program. So with that, I'd like to wish you a good evening and hope that you have a great week.